the leftists and liberals do much of the canceling against others, right? That's kind of...
Yeah, I would say, look, censorship goes on all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way our... Is that going to be a problem?
That's fine.
Okay. Censorship goes on all the time. It takes various forms.
Yeah.
I think the problem now, in my view, is that the left, or what's called the left, has adopted, appropriated the tactics of I don't know, I won't call it intellectual repression, of speech repression, which the left has for a long time championed the right of free speech, because otherwise most people on the left would end up in jail or they end up deported. So they were the chief proponents of free speech.
Yeah.
And now they've become a chief proponent of censorship.
Yes.
So, for example, all the attempts now being made to censor the social media. And liberals and leftists have been in the forefront of the attempts to censor the social media.
Have there been attempts to pass legislation? Because you said the government so far
Yes,
has done a good job.
Yeah, there have been attempts. There have been a lot of attempts to pass legislation curbing criticism of Israel. That's been a very popular, very popular among some groups of people to declare BDS anti-Semitic and to try to limit the speech. But there's all sorts of other battles being fought between, on the one hand, those who still regard the freedom of speech or the First Amendment as a foundation stone of not so much our society, but a foundation stone of trying to find truth. That you can't find truth if you...
Manufactured consent. Yeah.
Well, you can't find truth if you suppress everybody who agrees with you, disagrees with you. How do you know what truth is?
Yeah.
If you make a statement, and I say to you, well, that statement is false, your immediate reaction is going to be, really, prove me wrong. That's how you establish the truth. You make an assertion, and then if somebody else assessed or questions your assertion, your reply is, prove me wrong. What if your reply would be, shut up? Would that be an honest search for truth if your reply was shut up?
Sounds like the Middle East.
So I'm saying that what any 2-year-old knows, that if you really are committed to the truthfulness of your statement, you have to allow those who disagree with you to challenge you, and then you have the obligation, if you're committed to truth, to answer the challenge to your truth.
Yeah.
That's how you gradually, slowly acquire truth, through the exchange of agreement, disagreement, argument, counter-argument. That's how you gradually, as I say, finally refine your argument until it's as close to truth as possible. But cancel culture denies the person the right to disagree. The cancel culture is, shut up, instead of prove me wrong.
And why is it that cancel culture is such? There's a fear, there's a weakness, there's an uncertainty in the facts or the perspectives that really rile people up into wanting to have...
I think it's
very much a humanistic element.
I think that basically what you're saying is true. If you're confident in your assertions, you're never afraid of naysayers. Your attitude is... I used to go into debates, as I frequently did in the Israel-Palestine conflict. My attitude was, bring it on. Okay, let me hear your counter-argument. I think I can answer it.
Yeah.
If you recall, when I used to speak publicly, I would always say, dissenters get to ask the first questions. So I would be, once I finished my presentation, I would say, are there any dissenters in the room? You go first. I was not afraid of the dissent. Now, if you say, if you're a dissenter, leave the room, that to me is an indication that you're not very confident in what you're saying.
All right, so in the book, you almost exclusively attack the political left, not the right. But since you self-describe very much as a person of the left, a crusty, crotchety, cantankerous, contrarian, communist is how you formulate it in the text.
Crotchety, not crochet. Crotchety.
All right, you must in some fundamental sense, and at the end of the day, consider the political right to be your deepest adversary. So why focus so much on the left at this moment in time, Mr. Finkelstein? This is a question from Jonas, by the way, right? Jonas, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yes, cool. Thank you, Jonas. Shout out to Jonas.
Because I think the left has had a historic tradition. Obviously, the tradition has its weaknesses and its strengths, and one has to critically assimilate the past, learn from it, but there's a general trajectory. And I think that in the current times, a strange thing happened. What happened was our economic system, the American economic system, is now failing for 80% of Americans in a way that it hasn't failed since the Great Depression in the 1930s. So there's a large constituency of people in general, but young people in particular, who are ready for a political program based on economic fairness, economic redistribution of wealth, and all of the classic themes of the left. And just at the moment when this constituency was forming, was coming into being, its most potent expression was the slogan at the time of Occupy, "We are the 99%, which is to say, 99% of us are being shafted by this system. Now, I happen to think it's less than 99%. It's about 80%, 85%. There are 15% who are doing just fine. In New York City, you could say the 15% consist of the super rich, on the Upper East Side, and then those who are involved in either IT or finance. If you're in IT or in finance, or the classic wealthy professions, namely law, medicine, and so forth, or the inherited wealth, on the Upper East Side, if you figure in those classes, you're doing fine. That would be probably around 15%. And then the other 85%, those are the real 99%. It's really about 85%. Well, what happened? Just at the point where the constituency materialized for a economic program that embraced the overwhelming majority of the American people, along came this thing called identity politics, cancel culture, this cult of transgender persons, the pronouns, all of this garbage, which has disoriented the left, the classic left, just at the moment when there were real possibilities, as evidenced by the Bernie Sanders campaign, the primary campaign, that there was a real possibility for something to happen. And so I felt it was important now to, so to speak, expose this nonsense which is diverting and really in some ways destroying a movement that has real possibilities to affect real change that will have a real impact on real people, 85% of the people. And at this moment in time, to get obsessed by things like your pronouns strikes me as certifiable lunacy. By the way, you yourself speak to that generational divide, that problem. How many people do you live with?
Currently, 3 others.
Right. A typical person in the 85%, the 85%, they're living 4 to a place.
Yeah.
That's what I've discovered. I'm always talking to young people. You pay about $650 rent. In New York, it was, it started a few years ago. It was about $800. Now it's up to $1,000. And you don't have permanent work. You don't have health insurance through your work. You don't have vacation time each year. You don't have a pension. In other words, by the standards of my generation, you don't have a job. See, my generation meant if you had a job, it meant you worked 40 hours a week. It meant you had sick days, vacation days. It meant you had a pension. It meant you had health care. That's what a job meant. That's what a job meant. So you are part of that constituency which could easily have been won over to a relatively radical economic program, as it was exemplified by Bernie Sanders. Medicare for all, abolish student debt, abolish college tuition, a mass public works program, and a massive redistribution of wealth. Would you have voted for that?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Can you think of any person among your friends who would not have supported that?
Maybe the ultra rich.
Right, but I said among your friends.
Hey, I got rich friends. Come
Oh,
on.
you do?
No, I don't. I'm just kidding. All right. Yeah, I got you. Okay. Yeah, it's very true.
So, the point of the book was to say, this is not just a nonsense, but it's all this identity politics and anti-racism. It's not just nonsense, but it's a very destructive force just at the moment where when real possibilities exist.
So it's more like a proxy, it sounds like, This is more of a...
I think in part it's a proxy of the ruling class to
Yeah.
try to divide
Of course.
the 85%, to fragment them, fraction them. I think in part it is a proxy. And it's not altogether surprising that a lot of these identity politics people, they get huge amounts of corporate support. They become anti-racism experts for big corporations. They just roll in cash as they spout psychobabble, sheer nonsense.
This is very much reminiscent of the NGOs in Ramallah, for instance, as well, right?
It's the same tactic.
Yeah. Divide and conquer, in a sense.
You create among the oppressed, you pluck out a few, throw 10 tons of money at them, and then they become the spokespersons. And these spokespersons sound so radical.
Yeah.
BDS, they have their slogan, BDS. We have ours, BLM, Black Lives Matter. They have their slogans. They sound so radical. There they say, one state from the river to the sea. Here they say, abolish the prisons, prison abolitionism. They have all these radical sounding phrases, have no connection whatsoever to reality. And guess what? They get paid tons of money. It's a classic case of having your cake and eating it. You get both. You have your cake and you eat it. You get to sound radical, and you get deluged with money and perquisites of power.
Yeah.
Yes, it's like the Ramallah NGOs.
How many folks among the common populace notice what is actually going on in the way that you critique it, in the way that you...
I don't think they notice it in the way I critique it. What happens is something different. They become cynical about all political movements, about political power, about the possibility of change. They see these guys, this is a race hustler. They know it. They know it. But they don't make a public display of it like I do. I get angry, I speak about. They just drop out, which is the biggest disaster of all.
Got you.
You saw it during the Black Lives Matter movement, because the first weeks, the first demonstrations, they were about 50% white, 50% black. By the third week, it was about 10% black. They dropped out because they realized, not that they had they figured it out. Some intuition told them, this is bullshit, it's not going anywhere. And they just disappeared.
I agree. Okay. In your chapters on both DiAngelo and Kendi, you bring up the idea that their worldviews in some respects come close to mirroring those of the far right. Of DiAngelo, you write, DiAngelo is the flip side of the white alt-right nationalists stoking race hatred by telling white workers that they are out to take away our privileges. Sure, she says, these white privileges constitute ill-gotten gains, but the bottom line is the same. If they get their way, we lose big time. And then of Kendi, you say the assimilationist, according to Kendi, denigrates black and elevates white culture. As a preliminary point, consider how much ground Kendi has already surrendered to racists. He in effect concedes that a white American culture exists, hermetically sealed off from African American culture, and that this white culture can be conceptualized independently of the contributions by black people, or for that matter, the crimes committed against black people. Okay, so as someone who's been active on the political left for decades, how do you view this flip side dynamic you describe in DiAngelo and Kendi? Do you see this coming from, let's call it, authentic parts of the left tradition, or is this something more recent and foreign?
Look.
Thank you, Jonas.
We're going to have to figure out a way, Mr. Suleiman,
Yes, sir. Yes,
to
sir.
make these questions accessible to the reader, because those are hard questions.
Yeah.
So,
I'll put it in the description of the video, the questions themselves.
yeah,
Sound good?
yeah. Look, there are some basic facts. Racism is real, and at some level, white people in general have been beneficiaries of this racism. It could be because black people were slaves, so the whites in the South en masse benefited from slave labor. It could be because our economy was built on the cheap production of cotton in the 19th century. So our economy as a whole benefited from cheap black labor. It could be because black people were kept out of the job market, so whites didn't have to compete against black people for the better jobs. So it would be silly, in my mind, to deny that whites in general have been beneficiaries of a system of racism. That I have no problem with. What I do have a problem with is the argument that whites in general have been equal beneficiaries of racism, namely me and Jeff Bezos have equally benefited from this system. I don't accept that, and I also don't accept that there is a broad, I don't accept that there is, let's put it positively, in my view, there is a broad common interest between most whites, that 85%, and most blacks against those who are beneficiaries of the system. That we have a lot more in common, especially at this moment in time, between the white non-beneficiaries of this system and the black non-beneficiaries of this system. We have a lot in common. Again, you saw that during the George Floyd demonstrations. It was clear, at least to me, that there was a real solidarity, not just against racism that was manifest in those demonstrations. There was a solidarity of common interest, namely that this system is shafting all of us. Now, is it worse for black people? Yes. But are we all being shafted by the system? That's yes also. What people like DiAngelo and Kendi do is they set at odds, they create friction and conflict among the 85% of whites and blacks who have an overarching common interest. The message Robin DiAngelo says is, except for me, meaning her, this airhead, this white Whoopi Goldberg, except for her, you can't trust white people. That's what she's telling blacks. Don't trust them. They think you're all apes and gorillas. I mean that, that's what she says. They think you're all apes and gorillas. They're all benefiting from the system. Jeff Bezos, Norman Finkelstein, there's no difference between them. They're both white exploiters of black people. So her message is, don't unite. Don't work together. Don't trust them. She's just an agent of the ruling elites. That's why they like her, because she divides.
That's why she has such a big platform as well, it sounds like, too. Yeah. Is there any way to counter this sort of thing, other than actual doing the opposite of what they suggest?
Well, you know, it's actually a problem now,
Yeah.
because all these corporations are hiring these diversity, equity, and inclusion counselors. These really crazy people, sheer lunatics. And then you have to attend their seminars and attend their meetings, and you have to learn how to get along. It's like a freak show. Do black people need Robin DiAngelo? What, they're so shy? They're all such, what's the word, shrinking violets? If a black person has a complaint, let him or her register the complaint. Or let them collectively register the complaint. What do they need Robin DiAngelo for? This flaky Whoopi Goldberg in dreads. What do they need her for? So, it is becoming a menace, these people, with their lecturing on racism. And she talks about, she gives feedback in order to build up your race stamina. I mean, these are freaks. She's like a personal trainer in racism. Frankly, I mean, you have two choices: to just go to these freaky meetings and then just forget about it, or just to call it out and say, "I'm not going." That's not how you fight racism. You know how you fight racism? I'll tell you. The first way to fight racism is establish a living wage. That's a good way to fight racism. Establish a living wage so we can live with dignity, and that way we'll gain some respect. So I would say to Amazon, to all of these corporations, Google, who are now hiring race, equity, and inclusion experts, I would say save the money on your experts and just give us a salary wage, a wage increase. We don't need that. We need dignity. And personal dignity is not possible on the current minimum wage. So you take your equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion experts, shove it, and you just give us a salary increase.